Okay, we're going to spend most of our time talking about more modern Supreme Courts here. So finally, we're starting to see some courts where the makeup of the judges will a little more accurately represent the makeup of the country. A couple of important people you see here. You see Thurgood Marshall on the left. This is the first African American justice on the Supreme Court. You guys should know him. He was the lawyer in Brown versus Board, and an important advocate for African American civil rights. And then over on the right, that is Sandra Day O'Connor again. This was our first woman to achieve a seat on the Supreme Court, and this was in the middle of the 1980s, appointed by President Reagan. So she's the first woman. She's incredibly important in a lot of decisions of the 1990s and 2000s because she ended up in position to be the swing judge on the court. So she would make a lot of the important votes in those cases that were 5-4. In the background there, that's the Warren Court, and we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on the Warren Court because they have so many important decisions that we need to know for our test. All right, our first step in dealing with modern Supreme Court history is not really going to focus on the court, but focus more on the president. So Franklin Roosevelt, he's president during the Great Depression. His plan to fix the Great Depression is what we call the New Deal. It had a ton of different programs, and the Supreme Court started striking down a few of these programs as they were like not legal expansions of national government power. So FDR did not like when his programs were being struck down, and so his plan was to change the Supreme Court. So he introduced a bill. He proposed a bill to Congress that would have expanded the size of the court. So if the court went from 9 to 13, that means as president, he would get to pick all the new judges. So this was a plan that would allow FDR to pick judges that would support his policies, that would have his same ideas about how the policies ought to go. He also, here we go, this is one of those rules I like a lot. This would have allowed the president to replace all judges over the age of 70. So this would have been a ton of judges and a huge advantage for FDR. But one of those policies that might make our current court a little less unpredictable if judges had like a mandatory retirement age and all that. But this is a battle between the three branches. And so the president doesn't like what the court is doing. He wants to exert influence over the court, but he cannot do that without Congress. And Congress refused to pass this law. So this is where we get the term court packing. This was a plan from FDR back in the 1930s. So when the court doesn't go your way, the president may try to expand the size of the court so they can add more judges and get better results. Another important moment in Supreme Court history before we actually worry about the courts is going to be Truman, Harry Truman, and the steel mills. So this is a Supreme Court case called the Youngstown Steel Company. But what happened is there were steel companies across the country where the workers were going to go on strike. This was in 1952. So the United States is in the middle of the Korean War. And so for what the president claimed were national defense reasons, the president seized control of all of the country's steel companies. He was going to prevent the workers from going on strike because we need steel. We need steel especially in wartime. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said that the president did not have the power to do this. The president cannot just seize control of an industry for national security purposes. Here's what's important. Harry Truman, when the Supreme Court said to the president, you can't do that, Harry Truman accepted their ruling. This is the first time in the history of the United States where the president allowed the Supreme Court to limit their power. So the strike ended up happening. The steel industry was like really hurt. The workers got what they needed and all that. But the really important impact here is the president accepted a limit on his power by the Supreme Court. So now, ever since then, presidents have respected the Supreme Court's authority to limit their reach. So this is a really, really important moment here. And this did not occur until the 1950s when the president finally started recognizing the Supreme Court's power to limit their own power. All right, now we're going to talk about courts. Now we're going to talk about the courts that we need to know. So we're going to start right in the 1950s and 1960s with what we call the Warren Court. This is Earl Warren. He was the governor of California. He was a big-time Republican official, and Eisenhower, a Republican president, made him Chief Justice of the Court. So this is right in the early 1950s here. At this point, the court was full of judges that were nominated by Democrats, because if you remember, before Eisenhower, FDR did 3.5 terms, and Harry Truman, his last vice president, did a term and a half. So we had a long period of all Democratic presidents. So all the judges on the court were Democrats, and so Warren was the first Republican appointee on this court here. And so the thing that we're going to pay attention to these philosophies in a little bit, but just because they were all picked by Democrats does not mean that they made their decisions the same way. So about half the judges are what we call activist judges, meaning that they were willing to change policy, and the other half were judges who practiced restraint. They felt like it was not their job to change policy. And the Warren Court is important for a lot of different reasons here. We're going to learn a lot of these cases, but in general, this court made important rulings that protected the civil rights of African Americans, made important rulings that protected or expanded the rights of people accused of crime. And this is going to be our best example of what we call an activist court. The policies, or the decisions that the Supreme Court made ends up changing policies. So these are some of the important decisions of the Warren Court. We're going to learn all of these in a lot of detail pretty soon. But you guys know Brown versus Board. This created the precedent for desegregation. So Brown versus Board interpreted the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to say that segregation could not be allowed under the Constitution. Griswold versus Connecticut, and a super important court decision here that creates the precedent for a right to privacy that can be found not in the words of the Bill of Rights, but implied by what's in the Bill of Rights. Ingle versus Vitale is a court case that ended the practice of prayer in schools, like prayer over the intercom and stuff, which set an important precedent because it protects individual rights over the power of state governments. So people's their own individual freedom was protected against the states in that case. And then this last group of cases here, Miranda versus Arizona, which we've talked about, Gideon versus Wainwright, is about having the state give you a lawyer if you can't afford one, and Mapp versus Ohio is about illegal evidence. These are all cases that expanded the rights of people accused of a crime. So what's going to happen with all of these cases, they're going to change policies that existed. And that's why we would call this an activist court. But this is the Warren Court. This is going to be the court that we're most likely to have to ask questions about. All right, following the Earl Warren Court, we get to the Warren Burger Court. So this is Warren Burger there on the left. He was appointed by Richard Nixon as Chief Justice. Now, Richard Nixon was critical of the Warren Court. He wanted the opposite of what was happening in the Warren Court because he did not like the activism in the Warren Court. So he wanted to choose justices who were going to be the opposite of the Warren Court activist judges. So when Nixon picked Burger, he picked a judge with an opposite philosophy. Burger's philosophy is what we call restraint. It means he wants to stay out of lawmaking. He thinks that it's not the court's job to make policy, but it's the court's job to follow precedent and to interpret the laws as they're written. So this is what we call judicial restraint. So what Nixon thought is if he picked judges with the opposite philosophy, he'd get the opposite results. Instead, the Burger Court did not overturn a bunch of earlier decisions. What they did is they followed precedent, even in some cases where they disagree with the result of the case. So we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute, but that's what goes on in restraint. The judges feel like it's not their job to change the policy that exists. It's their job to apply the policy and to interpret the laws as written. So in the Burger Court, when they practice restraint, we get a lot of decisions that follow the precedents from the earlier Warren Court decisions. There's just a few cases from the Burger Court here. We're going to end up talking about these a lot more later too, but one of the early Burger Court decisions is Roe versus Wade, the court case that prevented states from banning abortion. So this, even though like the judges might not have wanted the result of expanded abortion in the state, what they did is they followed the precedent established by Griswold versus Connecticut. So if there is a right to privacy, then the right to privacy, the precedent here would be that abortion is part of the right to privacy. Swan versus Charlotte, similar. It follows the precedent set by Brown versus Board. So this is a program called busing, which we'll talk a lot about. But it like drove kids from far apart neighborhoods. They could change their school districts and stuff so that we could have racially integrated schools. And this Swan versus Charlotte case, like the judges might not have agreed with the policy, but it follows the precedent set in Brown versus Board. And Lemon versus Kurtzman, another one we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. This is another limit on the state's ability to like give money and give things to private religious schools. And so this follows the precedent from Engel versus Vitale that there should be separation of church and state in our public school system. So Nixon did not exactly get the result he wanted. He did not get the cases overturned from the Warren Court, but he got judges that had a different attitude about how they should judge. All right, in the middle of the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is president, and he is going to successfully shift the court in a more conservative direction. So he takes the most conservative judge on the Burger Court, and he makes him the Chief Justice, and that's William Rehnquist. And so the Rehnquist court moved in a much more conservative direction here. So the decisions that were made by this court were they were doing activist decisions as well. They were changing policies with their court decisions, but instead of changing their policies toward like liberal policies, they're changing policies toward conservative policies. So it's important for us to understand that judicial philosophy is separate than ideology, and that the philosophy of the judge that has more impact on what the courts will accomplish. It can happen in a liberal or a conservative way. So while the Warren Court created a lot of policies that end up looking like liberal policies, the Rehnquist Court ends up creating a lot of policies that look like conservative policies. Both courts are changing policy with their court decision. And here we are, the Roberts Court. You guys should recognize John Roberts by now. He replaced William Rehnquist, who died in 2005. So George W. Bush appointed him to the court. He was young at the time, so his court, he's already been in charge of the court for more than 15 years and is likely going to remain in place for a long time. In the Roberts Court, it's going to be most notable for the demographics of the court shifting. We've got more racial and gender diversity on the court than we've ever had before. His court has done a lot to like limit liberal decisions of earlier courts and stuff. They've limited abortion rights. They've ended campaign spending and stuff like that. So they've got a lot of the same philosophy as the Rehnquist Court. They are making policies in a lot of ways. But Roberts himself is also he's going to be one of these judges that really likes to stick to precedent and not do too much to change. So we don't have much to say about the Roberts Court at this point because it's still developing and will be going on for a very long time. All right, so we've had a lot to say about the courts of the 1900s there, the 20th century, going all the way back to the how the presidents changed their approach to the court, but more importantly, what we will remember about the Warren Court and the Burger Court. Those are going to be the important courts that we pay attention to as we move forward. So now we're going to shift, and instead of talk about what happened in the court, we're going to talk about the philosophies that guided those decisions. So we're going to explore some judicial philosophies.